Today we're going to talk about the failure of New Netherland. When you think of the Netherlands, you don't think of really America coming to mind. When we think of American history, we definitely know that the Spanish had come here. Christopher Columbus, he found the islands in the Caribbean, and then eventually the Spanish moved south for exploration. And then the French came here and they explored the north, and they went into Canada and the St. Lawrence River into Quebec and Montreal. And the British came here and they settled in Virginia and in Plymouth. But the Dutch? I mean, when we think of America, what comes to mind is not the Dutch. But just let's think of a couple places in America today and think of their Dutch heritage. Brooklyn, Breukelen, which is a town in the Netherlands, named Brooklyn after the place in the Netherlands. Bronx, named for Jonas Bronk, who was a Dutch settler. Bedford-Stuyvesant, one of the wealthiest communities in Brooklyn, named after Peter Stuyvesant, the last governor general of the Dutch. Then we can think of other places. Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. Rensselaer was a very wealthy patroon who was a landowner in the northern part of upstate New York. The New York Knicks, otherwise known as the New York Knickerbockers. Knickerbocker was a Dutch person living in New York. So there's a lot of connections back to the Dutch that are still in our society today. But what I want to take a look at is, why is it that the Dutch failed? Why is it that the Dutch are no longer really here and that the British were able to just assume and take over their power when the Dutch had a much stronger trade empire than the British ever did prior to the Dutch basically being forced out? So we need to think a little bit about the history of the Dutch people coming to this country. So like any nation in Europe, the Dutch wanted gold. And they sent out explorers to look for passages to spices in India, just like the Spanish and the Portuguese and the different European nations, very similar. Now, it was about 1609, and this has been about 100 years of exploration of the West. And there had not been much exploration of the east coast of the United States, really more in the south, where the Spanish had set up their colonies, taken over the Aztec Empire and the Incas. There was a British sailor, privateer, so he was a sailor for hire, named Henry Hudson. And Hudson absolutely is a very common thing to think of, the Hudson River, the Hudson Bay up in northern Canada. Hudson's a very popular name, named after a lot of things now. But this Henry Hudson was a British sailor who was hired by the Dutch government to do the same thing, to look for Northwest Passage, to look for trade routes, to look for marketable items that they could get from the New World to bring back to Holland. So when Henry Hudson explores this land, he is going to sail past Nova Scotia, which is where the French have already sent other sailors to Jacques Cartier, and Samuel de Champlain had discovered these lands prior. And since the French are trading with the Indians for furs, the Dutch realize there's money to be made in trading for furs, but we can't do it in the north where the French already have a complete control. We can't do it in the south for gold or for different items because the Spanish have control. So Hudson decides to search inland on the east coast. So he goes south of Nova Scotia. South of Nova Scotia, he sails around what we would call today Massachusetts Bay, and eventually he lands on Long Island Sound. And around Long Island Sound, he discovers this natural harbor, New York Harbor. And sailing up New York Harbor, he realizes that it's an untouched resource. There's nobody that's claimed this land. Although technically the French had discovered it as well, and they claimed it. But they didn't have any settlements in Manhattan or the Bronx or in that area. So the Dutch really felt that this was going to be a place in which they could explore freely and not have to worry about European involvement. So Henry Hudson sails up the Hudson River, which is quite a long river, hundreds of miles, and he reaches a northern point in which the Dutch christen Fort Nassau, just like Nassau County, the Nassau Coliseum, where the Islanders play, Fort Nassau. And that area, which is high upon, sort of not a mountain, but a higher point above the river to look down to see if people are coming up the river in order to defend the river, is today called Albany, which is the capital of New York. So this swath of land between Albany in the north and New York City in the south forms this area today known as the Hudson River Valley. And that area is going to be the settlement pattern area for the Dutch people. So a smart move would have been for Hudson to go back to the Dutch to tell them there's all this open land that you can colonize and you can freely trade with the Native Americans for furs, and there's nobody standing in your way, so start sending people. So Hudson and other explorers continue to map out the land, and other Dutch sailors go in there and they look for places to build colonies and to trading posts. And trading posts are established, and people are demanding monopolies over the trade because everybody wants to be rich, so they're negotiating with the Dutch government. Eventually, by 1619, this is about 10 years now after Hudson has discovered the land, there's a group of people who are living in the Netherlands who are seeking religious freedom. And they've been living in the Netherlands because their home country would not really support their sort of radical views on religion. They went to the Netherlands because the Netherlands had been somewhat more of an open society. I mean, of all the nations in Europe, the Netherlands was really the most liberal in the sense that other nations were run by kings or tyrants. And in the Netherlands was a republic, which was a collection of principalities which had a collective body known as the States General. And the States General ran similar to our modern-day Congress, with the exception that it wasn't a free election system. It was still these very wealthy people that were serving in these high positions. But it was a sort of democratic view that all of the different patroons and all the different high-class leaders, all these generals, these voting generals, had to make a decision together in order to act upon decisions that related to the whole country. So even though there were wealthy princes and dukes and lords, this States General really, they set the bar for law, and they made decisions in sort of a national interest. So the Netherlands had been a very multicultural, in a sense, country. Not multicultural the way we look at it, in terms of race and ethnicity, but by nation. You had Dutch living there, you had German expatriates, you had Huguenots, who were French Protestants, who may have left France because they were being persecuted for being not Catholic. You had Walloons, who were a French-speaking Belgian people who had been kicked out of France before. So you had, it was all white people, but it was a sort of a multicultural nation. There was not the push to leave the Netherlands, like in England, where there was a lot of craziness going on and people were looking for a change. So this group, let's get back to this group, 1619, they decide they want to form a colony in America. Now this group had been living in a town called Leiden in the Netherlands, and they had petitioned to the States General for a sort of a license in order to colonize in the name of the Dutch. And the States General, after thinking hard, said, we're not going to grant you this title. We want Dutch people to settle in these colonies. We don't want to send foreigners. And these people would then go on to petition the British government by 1620, and they would sail to America on a ship called the Mayflower. These were the Pilgrims. These were the Pilgrims that we know of as the founders of the British colony of Plymouth, who had been living in the Netherlands, who had asked the Netherlands for a similar patent in order to move to the New World, who would have settled in New York and formed the Netherland colony, the New Netherland colony, instead of the Plymouth colony. And the founders of the country might have been Dutch instead of English. And the Dutch might have had a stronger foothold overall. So it's very ironic that the States General, decided to turn them down. But moving on, so the States General decides not to send these pilgrims to the New World, and does decide, though, to set up a company, the Dutch West India Company. And this company is going to maintain order and serve as a company, like most of these colonies that were established in America. And how does a colony work, or a company work? You have shareholders who give money. And the shareholders who give money are expecting a return for their investment. So the company is beholden to the shareholders just as much as beholden to the nation. If you can't get enough furs to make money for the shareholders, the company goes bust, and the federal government, the government of the Netherlands, is not necessarily going to bail these people out. They're bailing maybe the company out in the long run, but they're not going to necessarily send extra money or supplies to help out this colony if it can't be self-sustaining. It's a free market idea. So the Dutch West India Company is established, and they start to trade furs. And they realized the most profitable furs are beaver. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about beaver in another lecture, talking about the economies between the Native Americans and the Europeans. But for just now, think of beaver, the animal of the beaver, its skin is waterproof. And think about how much that opens up for waterproof clothing, waterproof hats, waterproof gloves, compared to something made of cotton, which would just get soaked and not be useful in shipping, fishing, even just generally being outside when it's raining. So the beaver is going to be very expensive. The more beaver pelts they can get, the more money they can make, and therefore the more they can enhance their empire. That's the ultimate goal of this West India Company in the New World. So they established this new colony called New Netherland. They established New Amsterdam in New York, our modern-day New York, and Fort Nassau up in Albany. And all of the land between New York and Albany is going to be given out to wealthy landowners who want to take up the land, buy it from the company, and to maintain it. So you get all these really wealthy leaders called patroons who take these giant swaths of land and they allow for tenants to live on their land. And as a result, these tenants are sort of like indentured servants, that they work the land for a certain amount of years and then they get their freedom. So in essence, what you have is very little slavery in the New Netherland colony, because it's not an appealing concept to have slaves if you can work your land with indentured servants. So slavery never really takes off in the New Netherland, which makes it a little bit more liberal than the other colonies in which slavery is really the workhorse in the way of making cheap labor. So what's going to happen in the New Netherland colony is you're going to get a leader named Peter Minuit. And Peter Minuit, who is a Walloon, again, that Walloon is a French-speaking Belgian living in the Netherlands because he really wasn't welcome in Belgium, is going to try to colonize this new land. And when I talk about colonization versus just trade depot, I'm saying establish people to live there permanently, set up families, schools, ways of life, places of worship. So it's a permanent settlement that you're going to remain for the rest of your life, basically. It's not just going to be a temporary trade post that you're seasonally going to go to in order just to make a buck. So Peter Minuit decides to recruit Walloons, and Walloons, unfortunately, are the lowest level in the Netherlands as well, and they don't have any problem coming to the New World. So these Walloons, they come, about 30 of them, with Peter Minuit, and they establish really the settlement on Manhattan Island. And they buy Manhattan Island for, history claims, $24, 60 guilders, although that's being reinterpreted right now to be more like several $1,000s, as high as $12,000 or $13,000. I mean, the real issue was the natives had no concept of land ownership and value. So to say to them, this land is worth $1 or this land is worth $1,000, it's meaningless because they didn't have land ownership. It was, everybody owned everything. I mean, there were territorial borders in which you could say, this is my tribal land. But in terms of this island specifically is owned by this person versus this island is owned by a separate person, they didn't really have that concept. So, unfortunately, we did take advantage of the Native Americans because they didn't really have a land ownership concept. And slowly, Peter Minuit tries to expand this colony. Unfortunately, he fails. He can't get the Dutch or the Walloons to move there. And the colony, within maybe 20 years, only has about 300 people living in the whole colony. Mostly soldiers and traders, not really families. After several other director generals who fail, the Dutch are experiencing two problems. First, the British. So the British, as we had talked about before, the Pilgrims had come in 1620 and settled in Plymouth Colony. And then later the Puritans had come and settled Massachusetts Bay Colony at Boston. And were slowly growing. Roger Williams had established the colony of Rhode Island. There had been settlers who had moved up into New Hampshire to establish New Hampshire, settlers who moved south to establish on the Connecticut River Valley. Now, the Connecticut River Valley was also a really great trade valley for furs. And the Dutch said, this is our valley, we claim it. We were here first, so therefore we own the Connecticut Valley. And this is going to be a bone of contention later on. Now, for right now, the Dutch are willing to leave the British alone, assuming that the British acknowledge this is Dutch land, so if you live here, you have to pay Dutch taxes. The British really never comply with that, but they're left alone because the Dutch really don't have the power to stop British settlers from just moving into land they can't really defend. At the same time, the Dutch have a problem in the south. South of them, on the Delaware River, Peter Minuit has come back. So Peter Minuit is sort of, he's angry that he was fired. They don't really understand, historians don't really understand why he was fired. Perhaps because he was not getting colonists, perhaps personal reasons. But Minuit's going to go to another country and bring them the same model in order to establish this trade empire. He's going to go to Sweden. And this to me is the weirdest thing. I mean, I could never really understand Sweden. I mean, I'd never heard that Sweden had colonized America until I was much older and was studying more in depth with American history. But New Sweden is going to be a colony. It's going to be a viable colony, which is going to model after New Netherland and be focused on fur trading with the Lenape Indians off the Delaware River. And since Minuit's in charge of it, he's going to copy all the ideas from the Dutch West India Company. This is going to be a big problem for the Dutch because now they have to contend with the British, who are well organized and have lots of colonists. Plymouth is now becoming the largest colony with close to 5,000 people. And they have to contend with a southern competitor for their trade. And then maybe as a third level, they have to have problems with the fact that they're dwindling in population because colonists are not coming there. So in the end, what you have is a Dutch colony that needs help. So a new governor general comes into power. His name is Peter Stuyvesant. And Stuyvesant comes with all these radical ideas. He is going to clean up the streets. He is going to enlarge the colony. He is going to demand more people to move there. He's going to increase the amount of military presence in the Dutch colony. One of his main actions when he first gets there is to authorize the construction of a giant wall. A wall that today we refer to in New York as Wall Street, because literally there was a wall there. This is going to be a wall dividing the Dutch colonists from Native Americans who might be in contention for fighting over land. He also is going to want to get more soldiers to actually push the British and the Swedes out so that the Dutch can continue their trade. Well, after long negotiations with his Estates General and the company, he is told that he has to negotiate with the Swedes because they are much easier to negotiate with than the growing British Empire. The British Empire will probably use physical force. So Peter Stuyvesant believes that this is going to be a quick negotiation. He's going to come to a happy agreement with the Swedes and either force them out by buying them off or come to some agreement where they leave. Well, this goes on for 8 years. So 8 years of negotiation later, Stuyvesant's really no further along. He orders the military contingent that he does have to the Delaware River, and after almost about a year of off and on fighting, the Swedes finally leave. Now, the Swedes are defeated. The Delaware River is open for other nations to come to take over that same trade that they had with the Indians. Who comes? Lo and behold, the New Haven, Connecticut River dwellers, the British. So the New Haven settlers, they come down to the Delaware River, they colonize it, they start taking the same trade routes that the Swedes had. Now the Dutch are surrounded by the British, and the Dutch population is still small. And Peter Minuit is demanding soldiers to come to his aid. And he can't get those soldiers. He doesn't understand why the Dutch won't send soldiers. And the Dutch and the British have entered into a war, the Dutch-Anglo War. And Stuyvesant knows that if he can't defend his small colony with the people they have, then the Dutch are going to lose this trade post. Now, lo and behold, the British are not really fighting against the Dutch because there's a lot of problems going on in England. In the 1640s, they had beheaded their king, Charles I. There was 20 years of sort of dictatorial rule by a man named Oliver Cromwell, followed by his son, who instituted a republic of Puritan control, not really a king, but sort of acting like a dictator who imposed Puritan rule, which would have made the British really happy in America. But they didn't really focus a lot on fighting against foreigners while they were trying to deal with their internal problems. Now, by the 1660s, you've entered the Restoration. And in the Restoration, the British have asked the king, the son of the beheaded king, Charles II, to come back and to rule as king. A constitutional monarchy, they're hoping, but they want a king. They don't like this whole idea of Oliver Cromwell's dictatorship. When Charles comes back, after 2 or 3 years, he decides, enough is enough, we need to get rid of these Dutch. So what you've seen is, even though the Dutch were there first and they established a strong trade empire, they didn't support their nation the same way that the British supported their nation. They didn't impose the same mercantilist policies in order to bail the company out. They didn't put enough soldiers in the colony. They didn't emphasize enough colonization into the colony. And as a result, it sort of began to fizzle out by the end. And Peter Stuyvesant, in his last moments as Governor General, demanded that soldiers come to defend the islands, Manhattan, Long Island, and so on. And the Dutch would just not send their soldiers. So in the end, Charles II, King of England, ordered several warships to go into New York Harbor and to demand Peter Stuyvesant step down and relinquish power over that land. Stuyvesant had no choice with a small contingent of soldiers, and they had to give up. And New Netherland was no more. Now, after the destruction of the foothold of the Dutch in New York, the English are going to come in. They're going to give over the land as sort of a private present to James of York, the Duke of York, who is brother to Charles II, which is where we get the name New York. And then soon after, James II, Duke of York, is going to become King of England, James II, once his brother dies. So the English are going to come in. They're going to get rid of the patroonships. They're going to impose very British-style rule. Slavery is going to come into the colonies. The whole colony is going to become a mixed bag. You're going to have Dutch living there. You're going to have English trying to impose their ways. You're going to have all different groups that immigrated there, the Walloons, some Irish, some Scots. New York is really going to be a hotbed of multicultural ethnicities. So although you're not going to see a lot of racial differences, diversity is going to be strong in New York. And because of the Dutch laying down that strong foundation of trade, New York, as it is today, will continue to be a center for trade and commerce for the world. So I hope you enjoyed this lecture, thinking about this lost colony of New Netherland. And the next time, if you are in New York, or if you look at a map, take a look at just how many places have a Dutch-sounding name. And most likely, it does come from a Dutch previous owner or Dutch previous tenant. Just think that our 8th president, who came after Andrew Jackson, was Martin Van Buren, a Dutch president. Just to think, Roosevelt, a Dutch name. So there is this heritage of Dutch in America that we still have. But the reason that I want you to think about this concept is that there were other people that tried to settle, but the mistakes they made and the positive things the British did with mercantilism led to a more powerful British Empire in the New World. And even though mercantilism was a manipulation of the economy, it still did enhance the power of the government enough to create these strong colonies that could actually thrive.